75 years ago in Northern California, a man was found dead on the beach wearing nothing but his socks and shoes. His clothes were neatly folded beside his body. But his girlfriend, who had been with him the night before, was nowhere to be found, and her clothes were neatly placed beneath his. So it was a little after 8 p.m. on Saturday, June 17th, 1950, when 17-year-old Barbara Kelly finished her shift at the Goody Cafe in Fortuna, California. Like most weekends, she already had plans to go out that night. Waiting outside to pick her up was her boyfriend, Henry Baird, who everyone just referred to as Red. Barbara and Red had been dating for about 2 months at this point, and that evening they had plans to drive to Eureka, see a movie, and afterwards Barbara was supposed to spend the night at a friend's house. Now, I do want to take a minute to point out that there was a pretty big age gap between the two of them. So Red was 27 years old, nearly 10 years older than Barbara, who was set to turn 18 in August, and believe me, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking, and I agree, that kind of age gap is definitely concerning, especially since Barbara was still a minor for the next 2 months. But I do want to mention that this was 1950, and a lot of things back then were not viewed the same way they are today. I'm not making an excuse for it, because no matter the decade, it's still very uncomfortable, but I just want to provide some context for the time. Anyway, despite the age gap, Barbara's family seemed to genuinely like Red. Her parents and siblings spoke very highly of him, and from what we know, they felt like he had a pretty solid reputation. He was a World War II veteran who had started working as a bakery truck driver, which is actually how he and Barbara first met. His delivery route brought him by the cafe regularly, and over time the two of them got to know each other. So now that we've got that out of the way, back to June 17th, 1950. Before heading out that evening, Barbara and Red stopped by her house, where she let her younger sister know about her plans, left a note for her parents. It was just a typical Saturday night for Barbara, but unfortunately that would be the last time anyone in her family would see her again. That next morning, Sunday, June 18th, a fisherman and his son were walking along the beach just below the Table Bluff Lighthouse near Eureka when they stumbled upon a very gruesome scene. Lying face down in the sand was the body of 27-year-old Henry Baird. He had been shot once in the back of the head and was completely nude except for his socks and shoes. Just beside his body were his neatly folded clothes. His car was parked only yards away, its doors open, the keys still inside, but his .22 caliber pistol, which he was known to keep in his glove compartment, was missing. But even more alarming was the fact that Barbara, who had been with him the night before, was nowhere to be found. Police found all of her clothes, aside from her shoes and stockings, neatly piled beneath Red's. Even her purse was left behind, along with Red's wallet, which still had about $25 to $35 in it. That's the equivalent of around $300 to $400 today, so whatever happened, it was clear that robbery was not a motive. While investigators got to work processing the scene, Barbara's family was just going about their typical morning routine when two sheriff's deputies knocked on the door asking about Barbara's whereabouts. As you can probably imagine, they were shocked. This was the first time that her family learned she was missing, because remember, she was supposed to be spending the night with a friend in Eureka. They had no idea that she never made it to that friend's house. So with Barbara nowhere to be found and Red confirmed no longer alive, investigators were left trying to make sense of what actually happened here. And one of the earliest theories they considered was that Barbara had shot Red, either by accident or on purpose, using his own gun. Then they thought maybe she just walked into the ocean to take her own life by drowning. But the truth is, there really wasn't much evidence to support this theory, aside from Red's missing pistol and a statement from one of the lighthouse attendants who said he only saw one car drive down to the beach shortly after midnight and he never saw it come back up. But this murder-suicide theory started to fall apart after 5 days of intensive searching along the coastline and in the water by both Civil Air Patrol planes and the Coast Guard turned up no trace of Barbara. And based on the tides in the area, experts believe that if she had drowned in the water, her body would have likely washed back to shore at this point, and her family also pointed out that Barbara had always been afraid of the ocean and wouldn't have willingly gone in. So with no evidence to support this idea that she was anywhere in the water, and her family firmly believing that she was also a victim of foul play, investigators began to turn their focus to the possibility of a third person being involved, someone who killed Red and abducted Barbara and possibly murdered her somewhere else. This shift in direction was also supported by the autopsy results, which revealed details that didn't match the initial assumption about the murder weapon. So Red's autopsy showed severe skull damage that didn't match the small caliber bullet that would have come from his pistol. In fact, the skull damage was so significant that at first glance, it was believed he might have been hit with an object before being shot, but this was proven to be false when fragments of a copper-jacketed explosive type bullet were found, which shattered on impact and caused that significant damage. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, because the bullet broke apart, ballistics couldn't determine its exact size, but investigators believed it was not fired from Red's pistol. And for those who may be wondering, the reason the lighthouse attendants didn't report the gunshot was because the ocean waves were so loud it drowned out any possible noise. They simply just didn't hear it. This is one of those cases where police just didn't have a lot to go on. In 1963, so 13 years later, 46-year-old Gail Patrick Irish, a convicted sex offender serving time at the California Men's Colony, suddenly confessed to killing both Red and Barbara. Gail said that in the early morning hours of Sunday, June 18, 1950, he was driving around the Table Bluff area when he came across Red and Barbara in their car. He said he forced them out at gunpoint using a pistol, made them strip naked, shot Red, then abducted and sexually assaulted Barbara before driving her several miles away to a remote logging road where he killed her and buried her in a shallow grave. He even had information about the case that had never been made public, stuff that only investigators and the killer would know. Even with the level of detail in his confession, investigators were still hesitant. They needed more than just his word, especially in a case that had gone unsolved for over a decade. So unless Gail could lead them to Barbara's body or provide some kind of physical evidence, they were hesitant to just take his word for it. However, Gail did agree to help and was flown to Humboldt County to try and locate the burial site, but after searching dozens of locations, he couldn't find the exact spot. He then changed his story, saying he used a rifle instead of a pistol. He said he ordered the couple out of the car, made Henry lie face down in the sand before killing him, then forced Barbara into his car. He drove her to a remote logging road and shot her, but he said he didn't bury her like he had planned to because a pickup truck passed by and briefly stopped, which spooked him. So he left Barbara's body behind a large log where it wouldn't be visible from the road, went back to Eureka, and 2 months later he returned to the site, said the logs had been moved, but he didn't actually get out of his car. I think it's also worth noting that this remote area had changed a lot over the past 13 years, with 2 of the buildings Gail said he remembered no longer being there, which could have made it difficult for him to lead investigators to the exact site. But investigators were not ready to give up, so they took Gail to the beach where Red was found, hoping he could recreate the events and remember where he drove Barbara, and while he was there, he drew a diagram of the murder, which investigators said matched how the crime likely happened. The investigators really began to believe Gail's confession. They thought that he had done it because they said he had too much first-hand knowledge of the case to not have been involved. But at the same time, deputies were still trying to track down this rifle Gail claimed he used during the murders, and it was confirmed that he did own a rifle at one point, but after he was arrested in 1951 for sexually assaulting a minor, that gun was confiscated by police and possibly dumped in Humboldt Bay. I guess it wasn't uncommon for police to destroy seized firearms by throwing them into large bodies of water, and at the time, Gail wasn't considered a suspect in any murder, so there was no reason to preserve the weapon. Unfortunately, that meant there was no way to recover the rifle and no way to test whether it had actually been used in the crime. But there was a possible break in the case when 3 children came forward and told deputies that they had come across some bones while hiking in the area 3 years earlier. They sat down on a log to rest when they looked over and saw some bones, one of which still had a wristwatch on it. And the location where they made this discovery happened to match the site Gail claimed he killed and left Barbara. Now, when the kids found the bones, they told their parents. They chalked it up to a wild imagination and didn't report it until 3 years later. The children did lead deputies back to the spot, which did align with Gail's original description, but by then it was too late. There were no bones and no wristwatch to be found. But just because it was worth asking, a deputy followed up with Barbara's sister, who confirmed that Barbara had been wearing a wristwatch the night she disappeared, and it was a gift the sister had actually given to her. But unfortunately, that watch was never found, and without Barbara's body, without the murder weapon, and without any real solid evidence to back up Gail's story beyond the details he knew that hadn't been made public, his confession just wasn't enough, and he wasn't charged with the murders. But Red and Barbara's case wasn't the only one Gail confessed to. He also claimed responsibility for the 1957 killing of 21-year-old Bill Wells Hale, who was shot in the head while parked on a quiet road in Yuba County with a 25-year-old woman named Patricia who survived the attack. According to Patricia, she and Bill were parked on a quiet road late one night in July when another car pulled up. A man got out with a rifle, told Bill to get out of the car, turn off the headlights, and then shot him in the head before he even had a chance to move the switch. And that bullet actually shattered on impact. That man then abducted Patricia, drove her to a rural home, and threatened her with a razor blade. He tied her hands and seemed like he was preparing to sexually assault her, but the family who lived at that house returned home just in time, and Patricia managed to break free and jump out of the car. The man got away, the case went cold, but then Gale later confessed to it. He gave specific details about the crime that hadn't been made public. He provided an accurate reconstruction of the crime scene. And even though it had been several years since the attack, Patricia was brought in and picked two men from a lineup, one of them being Gale, and when Gale was asked to identify her in a lineup, he picked two women, one of them being Patricia. But once again, much like Red and Barbara's case, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him, and records show he died in 1984. So he was never charged with any of the murders. The only crimes he was ever charged and convicted of were a long history of sex crimes, some of which were committed against children. This year marks 75 years since the disappearance of 17-year-old Barbara Kelly and the murder of 27-year-old Henry Red Baird. Both cases are still unsolved, and no arrests have ever been made in connection with their cases, which means that if you have any information or know anyone who might have information, you are strongly encouraged to call the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office at 707-268-2539. If you have made it to the end of this video, I just want to take a moment to say thank you. It's so important to keep talking about these unsolved cases no matter how much time has passed, because every victim and every family deserves to have justice. That said, this man had no choice but to perform life-saving surgery on himself in the middle of Antarctica. In 1961, Leonid Rogozov was a young Russian physician with a promising surgical career when he decided to join the 6th Soviet Antarctic expedition as the crew's only doctor. But during that expedition, he developed a severe case of appendicitis that put him in a life or death situation. On the morning of April 29, 1961, Leonid woke up and did not feel good. At first, it was just some weakness, but it quickly turned into severe nausea and abdominal pain, starting in the upper part of his stomach and spreading to the lower right side. As the pain worsened and a fever began to rise, he quickly realized he was likely dealing with appendicitis. Now, normally, if you have appendicitis, you'd go to a hospital for treatment, but the problem was Leonid was the only medical professional on the expedition, and they were more than 1,000 miles from the nearest Soviet research station, which had to have been incredibly alarming. I can't even imagine knowing you have a serious condition that could actually kill you if it progressed. But Leonid didn't say anything, not at first. He just went about his day smiling, staying calm so he wouldn't worry the rest of his crew, because he knew they couldn't do anything to help him and getting out wasn't an option. The ship that had brought them had already left and wasn't scheduled to return until the following year, and although some forward research stations were technically closer, and by closer we're still talking hundreds of miles away, none of them had airplanes. But even if they did, it wouldn't have mattered because a blizzard was already setting in, making any kind of evacuation impossible. It was just Leonid, his crew, and several miles of sub-zero terrain in every direction with no contact to the outside world and no way in or out. So Leonid started doing everything he could to bring the inflammation down without surgery, but by the next day, things had only gotten worse. His fever had climbed even higher, the nausea intensified, and he was throwing up more frequently. At that point, he knew waiting any longer could cost him his life. The only option left was surgery, and the only person capable of performing it was himself. So he began putting together a plan. He asked 2 members of the crew to assist him and gave clear instructions in case he lost consciousness, setting out syringes in advance and walking them through how to provide artificial respiration if it came to that. One crew member would be responsible for holding the retractors, and the other would manage the lamp and the mirror. At 11 p.m. Moscow time on April 30th, Leonid began the operation. He positioned himself in a very specific way to give him the best chance of seeing what he was doing without relying too heavily on the mirror. General anesthesia wasn't an option here because Leonid had to stay awake for the entire procedure because he was operating on himself. So instead, he injected the area with 0.5% Novocaine, a mild local anesthetic that wasn't nearly strong enough to block the deeper pain that comes with an appendectomy. Sure, it maybe numbed the area area a little bit, but he still had to cut through layers of skin, muscle, and abdominal tissue, and if that wasn't already difficult enough, he also had to move his own intestines out of the way just to reach the appendix. He made his incision and used the mirror for a little while, but mostly he just raised his head to see what he was doing. There were even moments where he had no choice but to work completely by feel without any gloves. The surgery was making him weak and his head would spin every few minutes, so he took short breaks before pushing on, and eventually he found and removed his infected appendix. When he examined the infected appendix, it had a dark spot on the base which told him that if he had just waited one more day, it would have burst, which could have been fatal given the situation. But after finishing the surgery, which took about 2 hours, he stitched himself up, and with days he began feeling better, and just 2 weeks later he was back to work. Once the expedition ended, Leonid returned to Russia and resumed his career as a surgeon. Obviously, after this incident, stricter rules were put in place requiring extensive health checks before Antarctic expeditions, but surprisingly, this was not the first time a doctor had faced appendicitis in Antarctica. In 1950, Dr. Sergei Udovikov, the sole medical officer on an Australian Antarctic expedition, developed acute appendicitis. Although he was prepared to operate on himself, he managed to treat his condition by restricting food for several days and using antibiotics until he was rescued several weeks later. This actually led Australia to require appendectomies before expeditions, but other countries did not adopt this rule, although it seems like it might be a good idea to require that considering this happened not once but twice. This is honestly one of the craziest stories I've heard in a long time, but if you think you have a story that tops this one, be sure to let me know in the comments and I will see you in my next video.